Friends, so far we have been talking about how to face the interview before the Union Public Service Commission when it comes to the civil services examination. We had covered in the last 7 episodes various points of interest, such as how to talk to the interviewing board, what to speak and what not to speak, and how to make sure that the interview goes on smoothly. Today, I intend to cover certain aspects of the interview, particularly with regard to the kind of questions that may be asked and the manner in which the answers should be given. I propose to do this coverage in a pointed manner by specifically referring to some questions and the various dimensions that need to be looked at when the reply is given. Let's take the most common question that is often asked. The first question which many people have encountered in the interviewing board is as to why the candidate wants to join the civil services. There are a number of people who say that one should not say that one is motivated by the need or the desire to do public service when it comes to showing an interest in joining the civil services. But I think the truth is somewhat the opposite. While engaging oneself in public service should not be the only criterion, should not be the only reason for appearing for the civil services examination, it is undoubtedly a very important factor when it comes to taking the examination. We all know that the examination is a grueling examination and consumes about 1 year of study and effort. It requires intensive study, it requires wide exposure, it requires a great knowledge of current affairs and general knowledge. With all this, why would one want to invest so much time and effort in appearing for the civil services if he was not driven by some great motivation? Surely, finding a job and earning a salary cannot be the only motivating factors for appearing for such a difficult examination. There has to be something about that. And this is exactly what I think the candidate should be referring to when answering the question. I am not saying that engaging oneself in public service should be mentioned as the only reason, but unless somebody is driven by a desire to serve public interest, it is futile in joining the civil services, because the civil service is all about working for public good for a period of more than 30 years. And unless one is motivated by that desire from within, it is not going to happen that after a candidate joins the civil services as a successful candidate, he is going to be able to devote himself to public service. So there has to be that inherent motivation in him to do public service. And if there is an inherent motivation in a candidate to do public service, why not mention that in a straightforward manner before the interviewing board? Apart from that, of course, I do understand that there are a number of other factors. And there is nothing wrong in mentioning those factors. Candidates are motivated to write the civil services examination because some members of their extended families have been in the civil services and they have had a rich experience, an experience about which they are able to speak in an appreciative manner, and therefore the candidate is also motivated to write the civil services. In some families, the father or the mother encourages the child to prepare for the civil services because it has been their lifelong dream to have one of the members of their family in the civil services. Apart from that, there could be a number of factors. The status that the services provide for people in society, the decent salaries and remuneration and other benefits that one gets legally in the civil services, the variety of jobs that one is exposed to in the civil service, the possibility of moving from place to place and understanding people of different cultures, work of different natures could also be a motivating factor. By this, I mean, you can understand that there are a variety of factors which could motivate a candidate to sit for the civil services examination. But the primary reason will have to be the desire to engage oneself in public service. And therefore, coupled with other factors or along with a number of other factors which probably apply to the candidate should make a mention of the fact that he or she finds satisfaction in working for public good, and therefore one is motivated to sit for the civil services examination. Having crossed the first bridge, namely that of why one wants to sit for the civil services examination, there could also be a few questions coming in as ancillary questions, which would follow just as a corollary follows a theorem. It could be that, well, you are already in a very good job, you are earning a very good salary. Why would you want to sit for the civil services examination and join the civil services, and you may not be sure as to which of the civil services you would qualify for? At this point, I think it's very important for the candidate to inform the board that though he has or she has a list of priorities among the civil services, one is comfortable with any of the civil services for which one has filled in the form. Because if a bias is to be expressed in favor of one service alone and against other civil services, it's quite likely that the chairman or some of the interviewing members could take umbrage at that kind of a statement. While one is encouraged to give a priority list, all the civil services in some way or the other contribute to national development. If an IAS officer contributes to societal good for public interest in his own way, an IPS officer does it in a different way. An IRS officer also works for national development, but in a different way. He earns revenue for the government, without which no development schemes can be undertaken. Undoubtedly, there is a slant in favor of the IAS because the IAS gives wide-ranging exposure to a person and gives an enormous variety of jobs. But at the same time, the other civil services have national relevance, have their due place, and they are equally competent and equally professional in terms of their character, in terms of their contribution, in terms of their contribution to national good. And therein lies the point. The candidate should not, therefore, express a very open bias towards one of the services. Well, one can always explain one's preference of the priority list. At the same time, one can also talk about one's aptitude. But it's very important to remember that we should not decry any of the civil services. We then come to the second question, which could be sometime, probably it could be in the area of foreign policy, in case the Indian Foreign Service is one of the listed priorities. Let's understand what kind of questions may be asked with regard to India's foreign policy. There could be a question about how India's foreign policy today has been formulated to serve the national good, and whether the candidate can explain how the foreign policy of today is for the national good. The interviewing member can even provoke the candidate by saying that it looks like the Indian foreign policy is inconsistent because India is a member of various groups, such as a member of BRICS on one hand, a member of SCO on another hand, and it is also a member of Quad. Now, isn't there inconsistency? Isn't there a kind of trying to ride two horses at the same time? This could be the question. So it is for the candidate to be able to explain India's foreign policy, the consistency with which India has been pursuing its foreign policy, and as to how that foreign policy is contributing to national good. Particularly if you take, let's say, today's situation. India follows a policy of peaceful cooperation with all countries. In fact, even with countries which are known to be belligerent towards India, India adopts a policy of peaceful cooperation because it is in the ethos of India to mingle in a peaceful manner and in a cooperative manner with other nations. At the same time, India has to also take care of its national interest. Every nation pursues a foreign policy which is best suited for its national interest. So India, apart from pursuing a policy which serves its national interest, also, I underline the word also, normally underlines a very strong importance towards following ethics in foreign policy. If you take the Ukraine war, ancillary question from the interviewing member can be, if India is moving closer towards the United States and if Russia and China are moving closer to each other, why is it that India abstains when there is a resolution in the United Nations to condemn Russia for its operations in the Ukraine war? It's important for the candidate to prepare oneself for such questions beforehand. At the same time, clarity of thought and, more importantly, the appropriateness of the answer to the question that has been asked is very important. In this particular case, if the question is as to how India continues to trade with Russia, it abstains from resolutions condemning Russia in the United Nations, at the same time is moving closer towards the United States when it comes to foreign policy and supportive defense policy. It's important for the candidate to be able to explain as to how the national interest is served. For this, I think the statements made by the External Affairs Minister with regard to purchase of Russian oil and as to how it is necessary for India to purchase Russian oil to make sure that petroleum and petroleum products are available to people in India at a reasonable price is underlined. It's also important that in the long-term interest of our military policy, we are now moving closer towards the Western nations, particularly France, England and UK and the United States of America. So this is how the clarity of thought has to be there when explaining an answer before the interviewing board, because it may appear that India's foreign policy on the surface looks inconsistent, but it is not inconsistent because India is all the time campaigning for peace in the Ukraine area. It is trying to make a very strong bid towards ensuring a peaceful resolution of the problem. It is trying to make both parties come to the discussion table and work out a solution through peaceful means. And at the same time, its trade policy is directed towards getting products for its people at a reasonable price. And at the same time, it also looks at the long-term interest. It looks at the possibility of military supplies getting jeopardized in the medium term and in the long term, and therefore is also looking at suitable alternatives on the Western Front towards reinforcing its military hardware. And this is how the questions will have to be answered. And it's important for the candidate to be always mentally alert when answering these questions, because every time an answer is given, it's quite possible that the interviewing member will intervene with a question, or he may ask a question based on the answer given by the candidate. So it's very important to remember that the candidate should not blurt out answers which put him in a difficult situation, because from that answer could follow the next question of the interviewing member. So if this is a question on foreign policy about which a candidate can be expected to answer in today's situation, there could also be a question with regard to economic policy. Let's say the economic policy is about India wanting to become a $5 trillion economy, and the interviewing member wants to know as to how India, which is not considered so well developed, can achieve the $5 trillion status. In such a case, it's important to explain the answer with a few facts. The candidate should be prepared with the facts beforehand and start from where we are today. We are at a point of about $3.5 trillion today in terms of our GDP, and we are expected to grow at about 6.5 to 7%. At this rate of growth, we are expected to achieve about $5 trillion in terms of GDP by 25-26. And this seems to be a realistic estimate, considering the fact that the growth projections for India are good. India enjoys the benefit of the demographic dividend. India enjoys favorable assessment when it comes to investing in India in terms of foreign direct investment. We have a large number of people available in India in a trained professional mode who can fit into industries which will be started with the additional capital that flows in. Considering all these advantages and the fact that we have a long coastline which is available for trade both on the eastern front and on the western front, India enjoys a natural advantage for economic growth. Energy availability in India has been particularly addressed in a focused manner by the Union government, and we are moving very fast in the direction of developing our resources in the area of generation of power in the renewable energy sector, in the non-conventional energy sector. And therefore, the prospects for economic growth being bright, and apart from being bright, also appearing to be realistically assessed, it looks like that India will become a $5 trillion economy by 25-26 and a $7 trillion economy by 2030. So this is how we explain the answers to the board, and there could be a point based on this answer from the interviewing member, in case the candidate is either from Maharashtra or from Karnataka or from Uttar Pradesh or from Tamil Nadu, as to say, well, what is the GDP of your state, and how much do you think your state GDP will be growing in the next 3 to 4 years? So it's also important to be ready with that kind of a preparation while looking at the national scene. While we are able to project for the future, one must also understand that the national GDP is built up in the form of building blocks in terms of contributions made by various states. So if the states contribute, if the states grow, automatically the GDP of the country also grows. And facts which can buttress this argument will be very useful. Let's also understand as to why the interview is being conducted by the Union Public Service Commission. See, the Union Public Service Commission earlier did not even have a paper on ethics for the civil services examination. The paper on ethics was introduced only in the year 2013. And prior to that, it was at the time of the interview that the ethical suitability of the candidate for the civil services was being assessed. Now, how is it important when it comes to looking at the interview? Today, we have a paper on ethics, integrity and aptitude. But in addition to that paper, we also have the interview where a total marking of 250 marks is available. Just because a written paper on ethics has been introduced, it does not mean that the emphasis that the Commission will place on ethical suitability of the candidate when assessing that in the interview will be any less. Today, when the candidate is being questioned, the answers which he or she provides will have to have that kind of an ethical foundation in every answer. Unless the ethical foundation is coming through in the answers, it will be difficult for the candidate to make a good impression on the interviewing member and on the board. I will give you a very simple example. Going back to the same point about foreign policy and as to how India adopts ethics even in international matters, one can go on to add, when giving an answer on any aspect of foreign policy of India, that India has never been an expansionist nation. It has always been contented with what it has. But it is, of course, very careful to make sure that not an inch of land of Indian territory is encroached upon by a foreign invader or an aggressor. When it came to nuclear weapons, India was a late starter because of its emphasis on non-violence for a long time, and there was a hope that in the international sphere, the development of nuclear weapons will gradually be reduced and will taper off. But when that was not happening and nations continued to stockpile nuclear weapons, India conducted nuclear tests twice, in 1974 and again in 1998. When conducting the tests, it clearly made it known to the international community that India will never use nuclear weapons as an aggressor. No first use policy of nuclear weapons was clearly emphasized at that time. This goes on to show how ethics forms an underlying basis in our decision making, even in matters of international policy, where national interest is supposed to be guiding and governing the formulation of policy. Again, in Ukraine, India does not want the hostile situation to continue for long, because it understands that lives are being lost, property is being lost, there is enormous bloodshed, and there is an aggravation of tensions in the area around the war and also internationally. So looking at all these dimensions, India has been systematically, consistently and repeatedly campaigning for a peaceful end, peaceful dialogue to end the war.